Okay, guys. So thanks for the introduction there. My presentation today is based on the youth player as he transitions to become the adult or the minor player and senior and so on and so forth. It will be backboned by some research that I would have done myself in relation to talent identification, which I suppose in simple terms is the likes of our selection teams, our development squads, which we know now that lead in or lead towards our senior teams, our inter-county setups. Okay. So I suppose the theme of the title I put on my presentation was is a level playing field, the transition from the adolescent to the adult. Are we giving everybody a fair chance from a young age right through in the middle adolescence right up to the minor under 21 and so on? Okay. Are we doing all our players a disservice? Are we biasing certain players? How does this work? So that's basically how my research came about. I'll talk a little bit about talent identification, a phenomenon called the relative age effect, which is a bias towards those born earlier in the year as opposed to later in the year in an annual cohort. The relative age effect, does it actually exist? So I did a research study involving a couple of 100 or 1,000 dates of births over all the counties, predominantly in Munster, Leinster and Connacht, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I suppose the most important thing that we're all here for is the implication for our coaches ourselves. Okay, so my first slide is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, okay? I'm not sure how knowledgeable people are in relation to the relative age effect and so on, so I will give a little bit of an introduction as to what I'm on about. But this is a slide that I revisit at the end again. So we have our birthday cake, we have our football and hurlers, our camogie players, our ladies football. We have our playing field, which as we can see is a little bit unbalanced, and we have, maybe you could say, an alternative form of contraception, okay, which I'll come back to in a second. Talent identification. Okay, so what is talent identification? Essentially what we're talking about in relation to talent identification, guys, is how we choose people or how we identify talent in underage sports. So we know that it's very, very prevalent in the likes of soccer, rugby, AFL, ice hockey, and numerous different sports, in particular in a professional context. The reason being that we're trying to harness, develop the most competitive or the talented players early on, and the twofold approach to it is a financial investment. So we'll give an example of a soccer club in England. They look to invest in the best players as young as possible and develop them, because in turn it'll cost them less money in the long term. Okay. I suppose one of the big things that took my fancy in relation to talent identification, or how it really got me interested in the area, was in relation to sport. So we have all been maybe involved in sport from a young age, where a certain player gets to go over to England on trials, or maybe even nowadays, I suppose a more topical one, maybe the likes of the Aussie Rules or the AFL. How do they choose these players? How do they select these players? What are they looking for? What are we looking for? Which I'll go on to in a second. So there is common themes and markers, guys, which has been researched and looked at in all these main professional sports. And what they've found is that you can probably categorize most of these into four main areas. They would be anthropometric, so we're talking about the likes of height and weight. Our physiological ones, so our strength, our power, our speed, all these different variables, endurance. Psychological, okay, so in terms of anxiety, in terms of how one is orientated, are they ego-orientated? So are they task-orientated? Are they more, at a young age, are they more looking to win, or are they looking to develop? How does that work? And obviously their technical skills, which in many sports, guys, particularly in the GA, can be difficult to quantify. How do you say scientifically how skillful a player is? We could all name out the skillful players maybe, but to actually quantify and break that down from a scientific perspective is quite difficult, and we'll discuss that at the end of my study. Okay, so some of the research. Look, I'm not going to spend. I can talk all day about the research that I would have looked at in relation to developing the test or the studies that I went at, and I will if anyone wants to talk afterwards. But the big thing for me would be the fact that there's an amount of research out there based on not just certain concepts or certain elements of talent identification, but this one in particular, which a lot of mine was modeled on, was a multidisciplinary approach to talent identification. Okay, so it's done in a number of sports. We have Tim Gabet, a well-known guy in relation to GPS analysis. He would have done it in volleyball. We have soccer here again, AFL, Australian rules football. The studies are plentiful there. But what they have found in particular in the field sports, the ones that we know our demands are similar to, so soccer, we'll say both rugby codes and Aussie rules football, is that in particular the physical attributes, the physiological attributes are significant determinants between, we'll say, our normal club player and the person who makes it at the higher level. We call it development squad or intercounty, which I'll call it for the course of the presentation. So the research is there. I suppose what got me interested in the whole area is what are we doing? So I wasn't involved in development squads. It was just maybe slightly out of the age group for development squads, but from now on, we say they're a big part or a big element, and a lot of coaches here in the room at the moment will know an awful lot about these development squads. So what exactly are we looking for? Okay? I want to know, I still don't have the answers. I'm sure a lot of you might have different opinions and different answers. Want to know, are we getting it right? Are we selecting the players we want to select? Is the return in terms of development of the players what we want? So are these the players that we want to make at the highest level? Are we doing a disservice to any players? And is everybody getting a fair chance? Is that level playing field there? I suppose the relevance in relation to this, guys, while it is aimed at the youth population, a lot of my studies was carried out, I suppose most of it was between 14 and 16 years of age. Those 14, 16 years of age, this was maybe a year ago, they're now 17. They're arriving into your dressing room now, so they're fresh off the production line, so to speak. So what, as coaches, it's a question that we can answer as we're going on, but what are we looking for in our senior players? So has anyone got any ideas or what are we looking at as a coach and a young player who's coming into senior ranks? Anyone got any attitude, did someone say? Say that again? Commitment, okay, commitment, attitude. Anything else? Do we have, I suppose the question I'm asking is, is it just people going after a gut instinct, or their own styles, or do we have is there certain principles or certain parameters that we're looking at as well? Say that again? I can't hear you. Good basics, okay, so fundamental skills. Obviously, you would imagine skill would be a huge element to it. Okay, look, I could stay here all day and you could have different ideas. We'll chat about these maybe a little bit more as we go along and towards the end. But the question I suppose I'm probing to you here is, what are we looking at? What are we looking for in these players? So whether you're a club coach, whether you're from Leitrim, Kilkenny, Waterford, whether you're involved at junior level, senior level, under 12 level, it doesn't really matter. This has ramifications or has implications for everybody, guys, in the association. Because if we were biasing, which we'll look at soon, certain players, most certainly the standards of our game, it can affect the standards of our game, okay? Because we're not giving everyone a fair chance. Just as I was doing this, I came upon my own a photograph. This is the closest thing I had to development squad. So there I am, I'd say maybe 9 or 10 years of age. Brian Kelly was our goalkeeper last year, and you might recognise James there, or recognise James Adolescent, probably carrying a little bit more in those younger ages. That was the closest I came to development squad. So that was a selection team, I think, around the Killarney area. So we would both be in different teams, Killarney Legion and Dr. Crokes, but that's an example of a selection team, I suppose, that we would have been accustomed to or got involved in then. It's obviously evolved and changed since then. So the other, I suppose, element of theory I want to cover before I go into what we did is the relative age effect. So as I said, this phenomenon is basically, it's the you can see the definition, the inevitable difference in physical, emotional, and intellectual development between the oldest and the youngest in an annual cohort, okay, or in a group. So essentially, I'll give the example. Someone who's under 14, if you're born in the first quarter would be January to March, and the last quarter would be October to December, okay? Is there an even distribution across the board? How does this work? So there's actually an abundance of research, guys, into this phenomenon in worldwide youth sport, and essentially a lot of the research is geared towards, or focused, or biasing the physical development, or the physical elements, the physical characteristics in relation to talent identification. So that's where the two of these, the relative age effect and the TID process that I was on about, that's how we married our study. The psychological factors are also important. So the research there is probably less, it's not as strong as it would be in the physiological or the physical characteristics, but the ideas of 1 year's experience. So someone being born at the start of the year versus at the end of the year at 14 years of age, and they have maybe cognitively 11 months of an advantage over the other person. So that 1 year's experience, intellectually and all, will have significant effects. And the other side of it is someone who's younger, I suppose, from a point of view of self-esteem, motivation and all that can have an effect as well, okay? One of the key characteristics, and it's the reason why we chose our population in the research study, was between 13 to 15 in the male population is seen as the strongest indicator of the relative age effect. Obviously, because puberty or maturation would be significant in that period of time. So, is it a double advantage? This is what the research suggests. Older, more physically developed players are more likely to be selected and therefore exposed to higher levels of performance, training, and so on. So think about it, guys, your development squad or your elite team, your inter-county team. If an older person is selected, are they getting the extra training? We'll say the holistic approach that the development squad offers, okay? Dropout. So our younger players, or our players, why are people dropping out? So younger players who are less developed and maybe aren't given the opportunity and not selected, they have issues psychologically, as I said. Physically they may not be as developed, and it may cause them to drop out, okay? So there, I suppose that's just a little bit of an insight into REE. So I hope everyone has an idea about where we're going in relation to the background for both of these areas. Some of the research, again, I'll fly through this. Basically, research in relation to soccer will be a big one, ice hockey, American football, and one, quite an interesting one from a Spanish football perspective here was, go back, sorry, is in relation to the wasted potential, okay? So the idea of players dropping out maybe, and in particular in Spanish football, you could say the Barcelonas of this world, the young, talented players that they try to develop. But as a national perspective, they looked at the idea of people who dropped out and the linkage with wasted potential. So is the overall standards of the game being affected or tinkered with as a result of that? Okay, so from a personal perspective, how I came upon this basically was, obviously I'm like anyone else in this room, I'm a big Gaelic Games man. I would have been involved underage with a lot of teams. I did a sports science degree in University of Limerick, and we came upon this phenomenon, the REE, okay, in psychology. I was particularly interested in it, and when it came to do my thesis in undergrad, I wanted to do it in something along those lines. I did initial study, and my master's I did a follow-up study. So that's basically how I came upon this research. I would have also spent a little bit of time in America and in New Zealand in relation to youth setups. So I would have seen how, I suppose in America, the resources, the time, the money, and the vast academies, I suppose, that are at their disposal. It's a little bit of a different system in relation to Ireland in that they have a massive talent pool, we have a smaller talent pool, we have to mind them. They're probably not as worried about the likes of relative age effect and so on and so forth. They almost think of it as maybe a factory process where they're getting in as many players and they just want to churn out 1 out of 100. And that's the same in soccer also. New Zealand would be possibly a bit more similar to Ireland in that Gaelic Games would be the #1 sport in Ireland, Gaelic football and hurling, but in rugby terms, it's rugby is number one. I think the second sport is it's either volleyball or something, netball, I think. So the idea of all this research in talent identification, that's how that was developed, or how I came upon this research. So the two things I wanted to explore. Number one was in an overall study to examine whether there is a relative age effect in this in association in Gaelic, underage Gaelic football and hurling. So it was done within the male population because the relative age effect is a lot stronger in the male population. And there's less research done, first of all, in ladies population, and secondly, because the research is very much conflicting. So some have found effects, or found relative age effects, and other studies haven't. So it's a little bit more conflicting. So that was study one, and study two was to compare or look at a smaller proportion. So we're looking at over 2,000 dates of births in study one, whereas in study two we're looking at these cohort, we're looking at them in more detail. So I had 50 club players and 50 inter-county players, and we did a battery of tests, which we'll move on in a second to. So study one, I'm not going to go into much detail. If anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about any elements of the study, I have no problem, but I want to just get through, I suppose, the key findings from a coaching perspective. So recruited players from 15 counties, got the dates of birth from, I think it was 2,150 players, or 194 players rather. 1,500 were from Gaelic football and 600, the remaining, were from hurling. And what we did was we analysed the birth dates in relation to quarters and halves. We also, I suppose, tabulated them in relation to the statistics, the population statistics of those years. So for argument's sake, there was roughly a 25% proportion of children born that year in Ireland in each quarter. So we were able to, I suppose, validate or cross over the research there, and we analysed our results. Okay? So what did we find? Essentially, what we found is, and I must say that this research was done in University of Limerick through my supervisor, Mark Campbell. What we found was in quarter one, which would be January to March, we found that over 650, so I think it was 30% of the players were born in the first quarter. Okay? In the last quarter, which would be October, November, December, we have 17%. So you can see the expected values here. So this is roughly our 25% across the way of the course of the normal population in Ireland that year. And here are our results. Okay? So there you can see it. In a table format, here's our percentages. Football, you can work your way right down with the hurling, and the combined total as well of hurling and football. So you can see basically, statistically speaking, those born from a big sample in the first quarter of the year are twice more likely to make a development team, an inter-county team, a selection team, a higher ranked team, whatever way you want to call it, than a club team, okay, or a club player. So as you can see, here's our Irish population statistics. So that's the even distribution as you go along. The second study looked at club players versus inter-county players. Okay, so 50 club players, or 53 county players versus 45, I think it was, club. And what we found from a relative age perspective, before I go into the actual talent identification, was that 73% of players in the inter-county or the development squad teams were born in the first half of the year, as opposed to 27%. So you can see that here. So 73% versus 27%, and in our club then, there's still a relative age effect, but not as significant. So we have 56% born in the first half, as opposed to the second. Okay? Second study, guys, we had a look at was, I said the cohort. So we had 53 county players and 45 club players, and their mean age was around 15 to 16 years of age, okay? We looked at them, we profiled them from the point of view of anthropometrics, so height and weight, psychological measures. So we looked at the task ego orientation, sport questionnaire, and the SCAT test, which is sporting competitive anxiety test. So looking at their motivation in relation to the first test, or the first questionnaire, and the second one was based on anxiety, so how they respond in situations where sporting contexts. The last measures then, guys, are physiological. So we looked at was a lot of the standard tests were used. So our med ball throw for power, our upper body power, standing broad jump, vertical jump for lower body power, 10 and 20 meter sprint are speed times. Our T test, just standardized one used for agility. Local muscular endurance, so our press up test. And our last one is our VO2 max, which is the 20 meter shuttle test, or commonly known as the beep test. Okay? So the results. So first of all, from an anthropometric perspective, to analyze the results, some parts of this may not look, or people may feel a bit overburdened with stats. Essentially, there's nothing significant found in the difference of height and weight. So that was a little bit surprising, because a lot of the research out there in relation to particularly the likes of soccer and AFL would have been that physiologically, so strength, power, speed and all, they would have been faster and stronger, but they would have also been bigger, so taller and heavier. But that wasn't the case here. And psychological, the measures were insignificant as well. So in a lot of the other studies, there had been elements of psychological differences between a non-elite player, someone who doesn't make a selection team, and someone who does. Okay, so they were not significant. However, every single one of the physiological measures that we looked at were significant. Okay, every single one of them. So you can see here, your vertical jump, 45 centimeters versus 40 centimeters for your club, and so on and so forth. So statistically speaking, we analysed them in SPSS. Each one of them were significant. So what we're saying essentially is we can distinguish them, or they are distinguishable from the point of view of strength, power, speed, and these number of measures. Okay? So what does this mean? This is probably where you want a lot of the researchers out of the way now. It's all simple enough, not simple enough stuff, but this is where it might get a little bit more open-ended from your point of view. Anyone who has any ideas can shoot in towards the end, but statistically speaking, a stronger, fitter, faster and older player will make the team. Okay? Is that right or wrong? Is this what we're looking for? Is that what we're trying to develop? We are? Okay. Has anyone got any other opinions?
When you done the test there, was there any assessment on the technical ability?
No, and that's something I'll come into at the end. Good question. The reason was because unfortunately skill is so difficult, it's such a difficult one to characterize from a science perspective. So for argument's sake, a kick, okay, I can get them to kick it 40 yards or 20 yards or sole or whatever, but how can we say that that means anything in relation to out in the field? So did you understand where I'm coming from? You could be a good free taker, you could be a good kicker, but is that applicable to being, is that useful to your team? Do you understand what I'm saying? So decision making was the big issue there, trying to coordinate that with decision making. It's something that I would like to do more study in, and skill will be a key component. So that is a part that's missing, and I'd be first to acknowledge that. Yeah. And that's where we're coming to, hopefully. So my study, my population was mainly, the actual physiological tests were aimed at the 14 to 16-year-olds. But the overall study, I got all dates of birth between 13 and 19. But essentially what you're saying is, am I right in saying when someone comes to mind, or when are they actually living out, is it? Yeah. Yeah, and that's the whole problem with RE, or this bias that we found. Okay? So I'll keep going, guys, and at the end we can have a little chat. Interesting enough, when I was on the way up yesterday in the train, I got the dates of births, or I got in a training the night before of all of the Kerry players. So look, this is not necessarily majorly scientific, but I said for the crack, I'll have a look and see how it goes. So I got everyone's date of birth, or their month of birth, on Thursday night of training, and on the way up yesterday, I put it into a graph, okay? And this is what it looks like. So something similar that's been translated or brought through. So I had 35 players, basically 22 of them here, so 11, and 6 and 7. So that's just the Kerry team, 35 players. Have a go maybe at your own club team or your own inter-county team or development team when you go home yourself, but there's nothing, that's just the months, and as I said, there's no major science behind that now. I just put that in. Okay, so the implications, guys, we're selecting stronger, fitter and older players. So basically, is there a double bias? So not only are we picking the older players, but are we also picking the stronger, fitter, faster players? Is that what we want? I necessarily don't have all the answers here. I have my own personal opinions on how we develop players and how we should look at maybe tackling or dealing with this phenomenon. But at the same time, there's loads of different people in this room who could rightly or wrongly have different ideas or different opinions on this. Okay? What about someone who's, I'll give you another example, someone who's overweight. Okay? So the physiological tests, they wouldn't do very well on, but they're extremely skillful and they have a lot of the attributes. Okay? That's an example. We already know about the younger person who may not have the physical attributes to do well in this battery of tests. So I'm not saying that this battery of tests is how you pick a team, not at all, but it's significant from the point of view of your club versus so we have an older and a fitter, stronger, faster player. We want everyone to get a fair chance, okay? Everyone needs a fair chance, and I think the least as an organisation to deserve a fair chance. And keep the standards of our game as high as possible. What do I mean by that? How would this affect our standards? Well, the best way I could describe it is this can affect our standards from the point of view of if we are continuously biasing older, stronger, bigger, those characteristics of players in the early days, they make their development squads, they follow pathways along the way. Are they coming to a stage later on when you gave your point about when maturation isn't becoming as much a factor? So when the younger, smaller players develop, are these older players also at a service? Because I'll give an example of maybe Fela, where players are, the big, stronger players would normally take up the central positions, the big positions. You put a guy in full forward at the end because you want to catch a ball. That kind of a concept, the Mo Dira player, we'll call him really. So is that a problem? Or is that what we want? Or the other side of it is, what about the young player who maybe doesn't get the opportunities like that when he's younger and as a result drops out? Or if he stays with it and goes along, follows the pathway along the way, is he in a lot better position to make it later on? So Paul Murphy would probably be a perfect example from Kerry. Didn't make all this, we'll say the Kerry selection team is on the way. No, he's arguably one of our best players and has so many different strings to his bow. Okay? Practically what we can do, or what can we do? Okay? What can we do right now? So leaving today, what can you do? The answer is, unless we change things drastically, there's a couple of number of different things we can do. But the big one that I want to make you is to be aware of the phenomenon. Okay? I want you to think about giving everybody a fair advantage. So that younger, less developed player needs encouragement, needs the opportunities to develop at his own rate or her own rate. Okay? That is important, guys. They need to be given those opportunities. If you take a short-term mentality or short-term view on this, basically the winning mentality, these players, very likely a lot of them are going to be left behind. Okay? Future research, I would like to look at research, or someone else may look at research in relation to the skill-based components. So how exactly we'll look at that will be, I suppose that would have to be decided, and some longitudinal data. So I'd probably look at following up a lot of these players that I've looked at in the last year or two, in maybe in 1 year time or 2 years time or 3 years time, and see where they are. How can the data, has it changed, or where are the early and the late developers in this process? There's two other things that are looked at quite a bit in relation to professional sport, and they will be alternating the age group. So the idea of a half age group. So for argument's sake, everyone gets the opportunity to have a higher relative age. So if you're born in December and you changed it every year or two to July or to August, anyone who's played maybe half age groups will understand the big difference that can be in relation to underage development or playing. Obviously be a difficult one to do nationally and to work The other one is biobanding, which I'm going to show you or talk a little about in a second. So biobanding in England is something they brought in a couple of the soccer academies or clubs, where they're picking the players for teams or certain teams and their maturational age versus their biological age or their chronological age. So in simple terms, a big strong fella who might look like a 16 or 17-year-old or develop like that will play in that type of an age group as opposed to him playing in the 14 age group, and vice versa with a younger person. Does everyone understand where I'm coming from there? So that's the biobanding, and it's something that I think Southampton did last year, and I suppose it was very, very successful. They're looking to build on it this year. They have a competition for soccer teams or academies throughout Europe. From a logistical perspective, thinking about running that in the Gaelic Games or in our organisation would probably be difficult. Would people agree with? But I suppose it's nice to dream too. So I just have a quick video. It's from West Bromwich. They have a program out called the Late Birthday Project. So it's looking to, I suppose, develop or harness, give them all an opportunity to progress at their own level. So, okay guys, so I suppose that last maybe 15 or 20 seconds is the key element. So you probably got a background on what they're trying to do over in West Brom. But that last maybe 15 or 20 seconds is key. So the idea of, the question was, are they put back in and how does it work, the normal coaches? Well, it's no different to us here in the room today. If we all take a kind of a short-term mentality or coaching mentality on this, essentially we're doing the whole organisation a disservice, because we're biasing certain individuals. We may be affecting the overall standards of the game, regardless of different opinions. And I don't necessarily have the answers to all of this, but the research is significant. When I say it's significant from your development squad level. You're twice more likely to make it if you're born the first half of the year or first quarter than the last quarter of the year. Okay? And physiological determinants are characteristics, are very, very significant, are significant characteristics to distinguish between a club player and a county player. Okay? So is this what we want? This analogy of everyone pushing or working behind the bus. So if we had different coaches, so one coach is pushing against the bus, so he wants to win, okay? We have the other coach who's behind, and he's very much looking to harness or create that environment for every player to develop at his own level. We need everyone working behind this, and we need everyone to row in behind this. And I'd imagine as coaches here who are interested in learning and looking to do it, we should embrace this knowledge as well. So it's not necessarily to say that all the elements of the development squads are wrong. Not at all. There's so many good parts to what we're doing. But I just feel that this little bit of information may be useful and helpful in relation to those less developed, the younger player, who potentially is the guy you want to see out in Croke Park, or you want to see in your local pitch or your local stadium. Okay? And will backbone your club team or your inter-county team or whatnot in the future. Okay? So to answer the question at the start, do we have a level playing field for everyone? The answer is, statistically speaking, we don't. Are we ever going to have it? The answer is probably not. But we can most certainly work towards trying to create a level playing field by working together and being aware of this. I think we can work, or we can create an opportunity for every player to have. Okay, so that's our slide again. Probably might make a little bit more sense, you know. So the idea of a birthday, your birth date, football or hurling, your level playing field. And if we're to keep going the way we are, is this important? The last point here. So the idea of when you choose to have your child. Statistically speaking, it may be important. Okay, so that's it, guys. If there's any questions, I'm sure there's a lot of different opinions that will